Okay guys, before we go on to making the actual sea float rig itself, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the floats and the floats that's available to you. Now there's 4 floats in front of us today, and this is only a fraction of what you can get in design and size. The most sea floats that you get on the market are designed to hold an amount of weight, and that weight helps you do 2 things. It helps to get your bait down, and it helps you to cast your float at some distance. Now when you're thinking about buying floats, it's important to think about the species you're fishing for and the ground that you're going to actually fish on or over, i.e. your venue. For instance, if you were fishing, say, shallow water, clear water, you maybe go for something a bit more stealthy, a bit smaller in profile. This was actually double the size when I got this float, and I cut it in half and I made 2 floats out of the one, and I painted the bottom black just for a bit of stealth when fishing in shallow and clear water. And I would use something like this when fishing for sea trout in sea lochs or estuaries. Again, a little bit smaller, a little bit thinner in profile, but it is longer than the smaller one. So you'll still be able to cast with this float using a decent size weight, maybe up to 1 ounce, depending on what the float is rated to. Then come on to the next size of float. This float is rated to cast or hold the weight of 56 grams. And this is a good all-round float, and it's also tapered at one end and thicker at the other. And this taper on the float allows you to cast at a better distance because it's streamlined as it's flying through the air. And then you come on to your really big sea floats. This holds up to 115 grams of weight. It will sit nicely holding that weight, and you can get these floats, I believe, up to 150 grams, i.e. it will hold the weight of 150 grams, which is quite a massive amount of weight for a float to hold when sea fishing. And you would use something like this float when you're fishing really deep, 30, 40, even 50 feet of water, when you want to get a bait down close to the bottom or even in mid-water, and you're fishing large baits like a live mackerel or a large dead bait. And particularly good that this can hold a considerable amount of weight, especially if there's a strong tidal current running, and this will keep your bait down where you want it to be. Now, most of the sea floats have one thing in common, and that is they're line through floats. They have a hole at the bottom and a hole at the top, and they have a tube inside which allows you to pass your line through. This makes them particularly good when adjusting your depth. Now, when choosing your float, it's all going to depend on a couple of things. It's going to depend on the venue you're fishing, i.e. if you're going to be fishing in shallow clear water, you're maybe going to need a smaller profile float, different colour. Or if you're fishing for larger species, like say big sea bass, codlin even, cod over rough ground, then you may want a larger float that's going to hold a considerable amount of weight. The bait you're using itself obviously has weight in it, and it's something that you may need to play about with if you're pushing the boundaries of the weight that the float's rated to. So it's just worth bearing in mind thinking about the species that you're going to be fishing for and the venue you're going to fish in. So let's get on now and have a look at the actual sea float rig itself. Right guys, so let's have a look at the sea float rig in more detail. Now obviously looking at this, it is quite short, and I've actually condensed the whole rig so it can fit into the camera and you can see it in more detail. What I would like to say is all the knots that I've used here, with the exception of the stopper knot, which I'll do at the end of the video, all the other knots that I've used here and that I would normally use is in my other video, top 5 fishing knots for beginners, and I'll leave a link up above. So at the business end I have my hook, and in this case I've got a 1/0 Sakuma circle, and circle hooks is a hook that I'm using more and more often these days, as it prevents from deep hookups on fish. You can return the fish and they're a lot healthier when they're not deep hooked. So I've been using circle hooks more often. Now the choice of hook is up to yourself, and all I would say is the size of hook you use and maybe the pattern of hook you use is all going to be dependent on the species of fish that you're going for. If you're only targeting smaller species, say you're on a species hunt and you're fishing around reefs, etc., then a smaller hook is all you're going to need. If you're going for larger fish such as big sea bass, cod, like I do around the rocks, then you would use a larger hook. One thing I would want to say is small hooks will catch big fish, but big hooks won't necessarily catch small fish. So if you are only targeting smaller species, then it is a good idea to scale down on your hook size. I then come on to my hook length, and normally I would use fluorocarbon no matter what I was fishing for and where I was fishing, purely because of the visibility of the line. Fluorocarbon, I feel, is much more translucent in the water and invisible, and it also offers a bit more abrasion resistant if you're fishing over rocks. Then come up your hook length, and I have a short piece of black silicone tubing, and this is probably about an inch and a half long, and this is the actual length that I would use on the silicone tubing. And I'll come on to the reason why I use this later on. The knots I'm using here are single uni knots, so single uni knot to the hook, come up the hook length to my first larger swivel, single uni knot to the large swivel. I then come into my locked in lead, and again I would normally use fluorocarbon for my locked in lead, but again it's purely up to yourself and where you're fishing. Uni knot to my locked in lead swivel, and I have a soft bead which prevents whatever weight you're using on your locked in lead or your locked in weight from damaging the knot that's attached to your swivel during casting. So you'd have your length of locked in fluorocarbon or mono, whichever you choose to use, and again tied to my top swivel, which is slightly smaller than the bottom swivel, and again a single uni knot is attached to the smaller swivel. Then have my main line, which is running through my float, and I've attached that to the smaller swivel using a Palomar knot, as it's braid and it doesn't slip. Again, that is in my video for the top 5 fishing knots for beginners. Line runs through my float, and I have a stopper bead at the top, and I have a stopper knot which stops the stopper bead from sliding up your float, like so. Now obviously, whatever depth you're fishing at, you can slide your stopper knot along your braid to adjust your depth, and your stopper knot will stop the float from sliding all the way up your line. Now in terms of lengths of my locked in lead line and my hook length is always shorter than my locked in lead length, and that is because this is an anti-tangle rig, and when casting, your hook is never going to wrap round the top of your float when casting, which happens if your hook length is longer than your locked in length. And if you don't use a locked in length, then your float when casting is going to be down towards your weight, or whatever weight is you're using. So my hook length is always shorter than my locked in length of fluorocarbon. And the reason that I have the silicone tubing on my hook length is because it offers a bit of rigidity to the line when casting. So if you can imagine that flying through the air, and the silicone tubing is a little more rigid than your line, as it flies through the air like so, it keeps it away from the line as it's going through the air, and that's why I use the silicone tubing. Again, a lot of people don't bother with the silicone tubing, but your line is more tendency to fly through the air, and your hook length is going to be closer to your line as it flies through the air. So that's the reason I use the silicone tubing, just to add a bit of rigidity to the hook length. And as I said, this is an anti-tangle rig for casting your float, and your hook length should always be shorter than your locked in length to prevent your hook being tangled around your float when casting. Now what I use for stopper knots, there's lots of different brands out there, but this is called a power gum, and it's elasticated. You get them in different thicknesses, different poundage. This one's £10 and it's quite sufficient for what I use it for. One thing to bear in mind, guys, when you're choosing your bead as your stop bead, which runs up to your stopper knot, is some of the holes in the beads are quite large. So when you choose your stopper bead, just make sure that the hole is not too big where it's going to slip past your stopper knot. Just another thing to bear in mind. Now when it comes to stopper knots, some anglers use these. These are little rubber stop beads and they're fine. However, I would more likely use a tied stopper knot for casting because it's a smaller profile than most of the rubber beads out there, unless you can get them really tiny. You've got to remember, guys, when you're casting, this rubber bead is going to be on your reel if you're fishing at greater depth than the length of your rod, for instance. And this rubber bead has got to pass through all your rod guides, including their top eye, which is usually the smallest guide. And if these beads are too large, it's going to get caught in your end eye, your top eye of your fishing rod, and it's going to cause you to get wind knots, tangles and backlashes on your reel. So just one thing to bear in mind. For casting, I would tend to use a tied rubber stopper knot rather than use one of the manufactured stopper knots, which are quite large and bulky to pass through the rod guides. If you were on a boat or a kayak and you're just going to have your float drifting in the tide and you're just dropping it over, then something like that would be fine. But again, for casting, I would stay away from the rubber stopper knots unless you can get them really, really tiny, small profile. And before you get out there, if you're going to use these, just have a practice cast or two to make sure that they go through your rod guides easily. I'm just going to go on and show you now how I tie rubber stopper knots to either braid or mono or fluorocarbon. I guess what I'm going to show you now is how I tie my stopper knot for my float. And a top tip is when you're tying your stopper knot is don't cut a length of your power gum, as you're only going to waste valuable product. So just take a length of the line of the power gum that you're going to use to make your stopper knot. Lay that on your line and you're going to wrap your power gum around your main line, in this case it's braid, 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What you want to do now is take your tag end of your power gum and make a loop and put it across your main line and hold the tag end in your thumb and forefinger of your opposite hand. And then what you want to do is wrap your tag end round again, round your main line, a further 5 times. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pull your tag end and the end is still attached to your power gum reel. And you want to cinch down on that as tight as it will go to form a compact stopper knot. Now, as you get practice, obviously this is for demonstration purposes, as you get more practice, you'll learn how to save wasting too much product. I'm going to snip this off, but I'll be able to use that again for another stopper knot. And you want to just keep maybe a couple of mil of tag end on your stopper knot on either side. And there you have a really compact and neat stopper knot. And you've only wasted one end of your power gun. As I said, I'll use this for something else, but because you kept it on your reel, you've actually saved on product wastage by cutting a larger length of line on your power gun just to make your stopper knot. That's your little stopper knot, guys, used by tying the power gun to your mainline braid. And as you can see, it's really compact, and I've left about 2 or 3 mil on either tag end, either side. And what I would suggest is when you're going to adjust your depth by sliding your knot is to wet your line a little bit, and that way the stopper knot will slide up your line easier and there's less chance of the rubber becoming unravelled and falling off, and then you'll need to retie again. As you can see, slides really easily. Perfect little stopper knot for your float. And obviously you could use this stopper knot for many things, on rig making, to stop your beads sliding up your line, etc. But in this case, stopper knot used for a float stop.